Good evening. Government forces in East Pakistan surrendered today to India, bringing to an end 13 days of bitter fighting on that front. The end came quickly at a racetrack in Dhaka. There, General Niazi gave up the Pakistani armed forces in the east to Indian General Singh Arora. Niazi stripped off his epaulets and touched his forehead to Arora's, signifying subservience. There was rejoicing in the streets of Dhaka. In New Delhi, a cheering, table-thumping parliament heard Indian Prime Minister Gandhi proclaim East Pakistan a free country. She called it Bangladesh, the Bengal nation. Mrs. Gandhi also ordered a unilateral ceasefire in the West beginning tomorrow, but Pakistan's President Yahya Khan, in a nationwide broadcast, urged his people to be patient and said, "We will continue fighting not only in the front lines, but in the fields, factories, and homes." CBS News correspondent Bert Quint, who's been covering the war in the East, returned to Calcutta after today's surrender, and I talked with him by telephone. Did you get the impression that the Indian Army was pretty efficient and the Pakistani Army was not, or how would you compare this?
It wasn't so much a question of inefficiency of the Pakistani Army, Walter. It's just that they didn't have a chance from the start. Here were some 70 to 80,000 men in what amounted to a foreign country. East Pakistan is 1,300 air miles away from West Pakistan. The West Pakistanis who were flown over to put down the March uprising by the people favoring autonomy for East Pakistan were strangers. Not only were they strangers, they acted as an occupying force. They were terribly ruthless. These aren't just stories. These are things that we've seen ourselves. There were atrocities committed. So this was an occupying force, hated by the people who lived there, and the people were out to get them. And get them indeed they did in a good many cases. So here are these people, the West Pakistani soldiers, cut off from their main line of supply, surrounded by people who hated them and were out for revenge. And then along came the Indian Army, which is a pretty good army, and which terribly outnumbered and outgunned them. They simply didn't have a chance. What was interesting about this trip that we took from one end of East Pakistan to the capital was that it eliminated any doubts in my mind, at least, about what this war was all about. There had been talk by the Indians that they were in there to try to liberate the people. The Pakistanis were talking as though they were being attacked, as they were, of course. And what impressed me was all along the route of the Indian Army march, the way people turned out from little villages and greeted the Indian Army as friends, as brothers, as saviors. Now, this is not a thing that comes natural to people living in Pakistan, you know, because the Indians and the Pakistanis, even the Bengalis, have been enemies for a good many years. I'm afraid that a lot of bloodshed is going to come now that the war in East Pakistan technically is over, because of the great desire for revenge of the people of East Pakistan, and the fact that there are an awful lot of West Pakistani soldiers and civilian collaborators with the Pakistani Army there that are really in danger. In our trip up the river in these last couple of days, we saw a few floating bodies, and villagers of the area told us that these were not individuals killed by war, but they were men killed after the Pakistani troops had pulled out of the area. Villagers, people who were out for revenge, killed them because they had either collaborated with the Pakistani Army or actually formed a part of it.
Did you get any information as to what the Indian Army may do or be willing to do to set up protection for the West Pakistani soldiers and the collaborator civilians?
Yes, the first step is that they're taking the West Pakistani soldiers and putting them in the military cantonment. But what was very impressive about today was the fact that they did not disarm them immediately. They left the West Pakistanis with their guns, not to protect them from the Indians, of course, but to protect them from East Pakistani Bengali citizens.
What about the Indian soldiers and their attitude toward the Americans? You were traveling with them. Were they aware of the torment between our relations these days?
They're very much aware of it, and they do a bit of teasing teasing and joking about it. You don't really feel a resentment, a terrible anti-Americanism. They seem a bit perplexed by it. They seem annoyed by it, and because of it, because of the fact that the 7th Fleet is reportedly on its way, they were anxious to get the job done, their job being to take Dhaka and win over East Pakistan in order to give it to the Bangladesh government and, by the way, take it away from India's old enemy, Pakistan.
Quint reported seeing fewer casualties, civilian or military, than he expected, and noted that the Indian forces tried to avoid population centers in their bombing and artillery strikes. He also visited the neutral Intercontinental Hotel in Dhaka and said the American refugees there seemed in good shape. Mrs. Gandhi, in a note to President Nixon, has charged that America and other world powers could have prevented this war by exerting their influence to gain the release of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Sheikh Mujib is the popular East Pakistani leader who was arrested last March and imprisoned in West Pakistan. Some say he may be dead. Dan Rather reports from the Florida White House that sources are describing Mr. Nixon as disgusted that Mrs. Gandhi would attempt to blame others for the war. News Secretary Ziegler was instructed to tell newsmen that you don't prevent war by rolling out tanks and weapons. Rather also says the White House is still offering 7th Fleet ships in the Bay of Bengal if India wants to evacuate any Pakistanis, now technically prisoners. In an interview on the CBS Morning News, Pakistan Foreign Minister Bhutto said America and Communist China would probably be called on for more aid to his beleaguered country.
We believe the United States people and the United States government have tried their best to assist us. I have no complaints on that score, but if the fighting continues, I think not only the United States but China will have to take much more cognizance of it.
But China appears not to be in a position to help you at all. The Himalayas passes are shut now with the winter snow. It has no long-range airlift. Isn't it vain to expect help from that quarter?
The snow doesn't last for all times. And as I said, our dispute will continue if India wants to rub our nose to the ground. We cannot allow that to happen.
Is it proper to assume that you, as a potential ruler of West Pakistan, are prepared to ask the United States and or China for military assistance, including troops?
American troops we do not want. American troops should not leave their shores, not only for Pakistan, for other countries. We fight our own war, but assistance, moral, political, and others, we are prepared to seek. If they give it to us, we'll be grateful. If they don't give it to us, we'll understand.
At midday, India's Foreign Minister Swaran Singh informed the Security Council of decisions in New Delhi and an entirely new state of affairs between India and Pakistan.
This is, Mr. President, the information that I would like to convey to the Council. In a nutshell, the fighting in Bangladesh has already stopped, and on the West, unilaterally, Prime Minister of India has issued orders to stop fighting effective from 10:30 a.m. on December 17.
The White House said today that the possibility of a ceasefire in West Pakistan was an encouraging turn in the Indo-Pakistani situation. White House Press Secretary Ron Ziegler, speaking at Key Biscayne, where the president is staying in touch with developments, told newsmen, if a ceasefire comes and the fighting is stopped, then our objective has come about. The White House is less than happy, however, with a letter that Indian Prime Minister Gandhi sent to President Nixon yesterday. ABC's Bill Gill reports from Key Biscayne.
The White House considers the Gandhi letter to Mr. Nixon to be at least frivolous, if not downright silly. Mrs. Gandhi complains to the president that Washington should have demanded that West Pakistan free the Bangladesh leader Mujib, and claims that this alone would have prevented war. News Secretary Ronald Ziegler rejects that claim out of hand, and once again he lays the blame for fighting squarely on the Indian government.
Well, you know as well as I do, the way to prevent war is not to start up the tanks, put bullets in a rifle, and fire them. That's the way war is prevented. I think you are also aware of the many diplomatic steps the United States has taken over the last months to work toward a development of a climate for discussion to solve the problems in South Asia.
Would the freeing of Mujib have stayed the hand of India?
That's difficult to say. I don't know what action the Indian government would have taken if this had taken place. But we still feel, and we do feel, that the way to deal with problems of this type is to sit down and talk about them, to reach political solutions without war.
That biting reply is the only response Washington intends to make to Mrs. Gandhi's letter. The White House will now sponsor a resolution in the UN Security Council endorsing a full ceasefire in all of Pakistan, while softening its demands for a full and immediate withdrawal of all foreign troops. Ziegler left open the possibility that the U.S. 7th Fleet may be used to help evacuate the defeated Pakistani troops. A full review of future U.S. policy and strategy in the India-Pakistan problem is now underway in Washington. Bill Gill, ABC News, Key Biscayne, Florida.
The Soviet Union reacted quietly to the news of India's victory. The government newspaper Zvestia reported the East Pakistan surrender under the unemotional headline, quote, "On the Indo-Pakistani fronts." Communist China reacted with a warning to Russia and India contained in a formal statement that, quote, "He who plays with fire will be consumed with fire." China also charged today that 7 armed Indians intruded into China last week on the Sikkim border, and she lodged a strong protest with the Indian embassy in Peking. The possibility of big power involvement in the Indo-Pakistani war is still a dangerous element in the situation. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ali Bhutto, the man who stormed angrily out of the UN Security Council yesterday, talked with us today. ABC's John McVeigh asked him if Russia and China may become further involved if the conflict continues.
Well, I would say so. It would be inevitable. It's the subcontinent is inhabited by almost 600 million people. It's an important part of the world. If there has been war and conflict in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and Laos, in those countries for years and years, the future of the subcontinent, I think, is equally important, if not more. But that's, of course, not for us to judge. That's for the world to judge, and for the great powers to judge, and for other nations to judge. We can't talk about our own importance, but I'm sure that there will be responses if this stalemate continues. And we, as I said yesterday, we are really beginning a new page, a very ugly new page. We're starting with the first sentence of it is horrifying, and I don't know really how it will conclude.
I'll have more.
With East Pakistan as a current example, Eric Severide makes a case for turning forces of military into forces of mercy. Here is his analysis.
In a few weeks' time, the West Pakistani Army drove 8 to 10 million destitute East Pakistanis across into India. It will take months to sort them out and save them. In 13 days, the Indian Army has smashed up thousands of Pakistani soldiers and civilians, and it will take weeks to salvage these people. A year ago, a cyclone hit East Pakistan, killing perhaps 500,000 people. Many could have been saved had communications not broken down. A year and a half ago, an earthquake in remote areas of Peru killed about 50,000 people. And it was 6 weeks before the Peruvian government had aerial photographs of just what had happened where. Nations can make war quickly and efficiently. They are not organized to use the same technology for the quick rescue of innocent human beings made victim by either wars or natural disasters. But it can be done. This week, the United Nations General Assembly voted for a long-range program to organize and coordinate disaster relief. It remains mostly a plan on paper, and presumably the United States will pay a heavy proportion of the cost. But technically, if not politically, the United States could do the job itself. Experience has demonstrated that our military planes and personnel, medical and otherwise, can move much faster into a disaster situation than the International Red Cross. The technology already exists, including the planes, the communications, and the computer systems. It is estimated that 4 or 5 of the modern C-5A cargo planes could have kept Berlin alive in the famous airlift of 48, a job that required fleets of the planes then available. Discussions on how to organize this technology for human relief have been going on here for many weeks, involving government officials, specialists from the so-called think tanks, and private industry. Several years ago, the Pentagon broached a plan for pre-positioning military tanks, guns, and supplies in various spots around the world for quick interventions. Congressmen killed the idea, arguing it would get us into wars too easily and quickly. But the same strategy can be used for relief supplies and personnel to get us into disaster situations easily and quickly. Natural disasters like cyclones, floods, earthquakes repeatedly happen in the same regions of the globe. Help could be close at hand at all times. The whole enterprise could be, for America and America's image in the world, interventionism on the side of the angels.
And that's
Well, the 132nd nation may be applying for membership in the UN soon. Bangladesh, the Bengal nation, was proclaimed today in what for 24 years has been East Pakistan. Its Pakistani garrison surrendered last night. Prime Minister Mrs. Gandhi of India informed a cheering parliament in New Delhi. She also declared a unilateral Indian ceasefire in Kashmir in the west to begin at what will be 9:30 Eastern Time tomorrow morning in the United States. President Yahya Khan of Pakistan said he would fight on to victory. However, with almost one-third of his combat troops now prisoners, that's doubtful. We have film from the subcontinent and this report from ABC's George Watson.
It's premature to talk about peace tonight. War still continues on the Western Front, and soldiers on both sides are dug in for more fighting. These Indian soldiers are tough Gurkhas, famous for their fighting skills, and in this area they repulsed a major Pakistan tank attack. The Pakistanis left behind several of their made-in-China tanks, but tonight there is news of another big battle in this same place. Indian troops today did hear their victorious leader, Indira Gandhi, as she broadcast the news of Pakistan's surrender in the east.
The West Pakistan forces have unconditionally surrendered in Bangladesh. Dhaka is now the free capital of a free country. The entire nation rejoices in this historic event. All nations who value the human spirit will recognize it as a significant milestone in man's quest for liberty.
Now the Indians are free to concentrate their forces on the Western Front, and the odds against Pakistan are even more overwhelming. But Pakistan's President Yahya Khan also went on the radio today and broadcast an appeal to his troops to keep on fighting.
Assalamu alaikum.
He is saying, in effect, that you can lose a battle and still win the war. But most observers view Pakistan's position as hopeless, and they think this speech was mostly belligerent bravado and that Yahya knows he is beaten. If so, the war could come to a halt, but only if Pakistani troops stop shooting on the Western Front when the Indian ceasefire starts tomorrow morning. This is George Watson, ABC News, reporting.
We'll have U.S. reaction to the India-Pakistan developments in a moment. One of the illusions that written history creates is that the end of a war ends a chapter. In fact, an ended war usually creates new alignments, new problems, and therefore is the beginning of a chapter. So it is with the India-Pakistan war now apparently ending. Consider what has happened. A new nation, Bangladesh, is created, the 8th most populous country in the world. As it faces harsh problems of independence amid wreckage and poverty, its drift will be towards the many native communists who alone have the organization to meet those difficulties. For all her gratitude to Russia, India remains a liberal democracy and does not want another communist and potentially hostile nation on her border. More serious, Bangladesh, East Bengal, borders on India's West Bengal, India's most unruly, pro-communist, separatist province. The prospect of the two Bengals, who have a common tradition, working together against India's central government is one of Mrs. Gandhi's continuing nightmares. Indeed, one reason India moved into East Pakistan was to prevent the chaos there from infecting her own communist-leaning province. What I'm getting at is, though India now much admires Russia, she needs U.S. involvement more than ever as a counterbalance to the vastly increased potential for a communist separatist movement in her own subcontinent. U.S. policy in the war has been flawed, but by moving conspicuously with friendship, with aid, with whatever else constitutes an effective American presence, we could still retrieve our position. That's tonight's news, and a comment.
But first, India and Pakistan. At 1 minute after 6 o'clock Eastern Time this morning, East Pakistan ceased to exist and the country of Bangladesh came into being. That was the moment when documents for the surrender of East Pakistan were signed in the capital, Dhaka. In 13 days of fighting, Indian columns had moved relentlessly from the north and west, from the east and south. Perhaps 80,000 soldiers gave up. The ceremony of surrender was held incongruously on a racetrack. There, General J.S. Arora, Chief of India's Eastern Command at the left, formally shook hands with Lieutenant General A.A.K. Niazi, the Pakistani commander. General Arora waved in triumph. General Niazi's face plainly showed his distress. The two men are seen here on the way to the table where the surrender documents were signed. That was done in an instant, but for General Niazi, that was not the only humiliation. He had to hand over his pistol to General Arora, who made sure it was empty. And General Arora tore off General Niazi's shoulder insignia, epaulets and all. Again, very formal, very traditional, but both men are graduates of the Indian Military Academy. Away from the racetrack, in the streets of Dhaka, thousands of Bengalis, many of them hysterical with pleasure, greeted Indian troops. Many of them were relatives and friends of some of the possibly 10 million East Pakistanis who have fled into India since the government repression of last March.
Some of the Pakistani refugees have started back to their homes. Siddheswar Dalal and his family fled from a village in Khulna district when the Civil War began. So did his elder brother, Nilkanta Dalal. His wife became sick and died during their flight to India. Their younger brother was taken away by Pakistani soldiers before he could flee, and he is presumed dead. When the news came that the Pakistan Army was no longer in control of Khulna district, the Dalal brothers decided to return home. They crossed the Ichumati River, which is the border at this point between India and East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. From here, they will make their way back to their villages and try to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. It will not be easy, but neither was life in a refugee camp, and they survived that. So did several million other refugees who will follow them down the road back home. Kenley Jones, NBC News, Calcutta.
The war for East Pakistan, for Bangladesh, is over, but the war in the West is not 1,000 miles away on the border between West Pakistan and India. That war went on today, and nobody has any idea when it will end. However, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi of India said her Army and Air Force will stop fighting in the West at 9:30 tomorrow morning Eastern Time. But President Yahya of Pakistan said the war was by no means over. We will continue fighting, he told his people. The fighting does continue in the West. There were reports today of a major tank battle along the border, possibly just inside West Pakistan. As many as 40 Pakistani tanks and 15 Indian tanks are said to have been destroyed in furious assaults. In the air, the Pakistanis go on fighting too, with fewer and less modern planes than the Indians.
The Pakistan Air Force has a large number of old fighter planes, like these F-86 Sabres, made in the United States during the 1950s. It also has a few more modern planes, like these Mirage 3s, made in France during the mid-1960s. The Indian Air Force is larger and has more modern aircraft.
That is the French Mirage.
Still, the Pakistani Air Force claims it has control of the air over West Pakistan and says it's consistently beating the Indians. The commander of an Air Force base somewhere in West Pakistan says his pilots are better because they believe in their cause. Some of the pilots say the Indian Air Force pilots seem to be afraid of the Pakistanis.
They have to be afraid because for the last 1 week or so, we have to see Indian aircraft in Pakistan territory, and especially on our bases. And this proves to the whole world, I mean, we are convinced they are scared of us. Otherwise, why shouldn't they come into our territory when we keep entering their territory the whole day long?
Well, I haven't encountered the MiG-21 yet, but I don't think I'll feel any disadvantage being in an F-86 against a MiG-21. None whatsoever, no. He might be able to run away. That's the only disadvantage. But if he wants to fight, he's going to be in trouble with me.
There doesn't seem to be any simple explanation of how the Pakistani pilots could be doing as well as they say they're doing. It might be morale, it might be training, it might be tactics. It might not be true. The Pakistani Air Force claims it has shot down 15 enemy planes to one of its own logs. There's no way of judging whether or not that's true. But judging by the morale of the pilots here, the Pakistan Air Force certainly believes it's winning. Richard Hunt, NBC News, on the flight line at a Pakistani Air Force base.
The Indian government today, elated over its victory, made the unusual move of releasing the text of a very sharply worded letter sent to President Nixon by Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. In the letter, Mrs. Gandhi inferentially blames the United States for letting the war start because none of the big powers, she said, could get the leader of the Bangladesh rebels out of jail. The White House reacted swiftly and with anger. Ronald Ziegler, the president's press secretary, said, "The way you avoid war is not starting up tanks and putting bullets into rifles." Relations with India are now at their lowest point since the country became independent in 1947, despite the fact that the United States has given India more aid than any other country. Here, for example, is the level of anti-Americanism in Calcutta.
In Calcutta and other Indian cities, there are daily demonstrations against the United States and for the Soviet Union. In the war with Pakistan, many Indians think Moscow has been on their side, while Washington has been on Pakistan's side. At the United States Consulate General, demonstrators turned up with a letter protesting American policy. Many Indians are annoyed because the U.S. accused their country of aggression against Pakistan. The appearance of the American aircraft carrier Enterprise in the Bay of Bengal inflamed Indian public opinion further. The U.S. is accused of gunboat diplomacy and of helping Pakistan. The Russians, on the other hand, are scoring points with the Indian masses. The way many Indians see it, the Soviets have denounced Pakistan's brutal repression of East Bengal's Bangladesh secessionist movement, while Washington has kept silent. Parades to the Soviet Consulate General are comradely, especially since the Russians have signed a friendship treaty with India and are rumored to be considering recognizing India's protege government of Bangladesh. American aid to India is forgotten. George Montgomery, NBC News.
In her letter, Mrs. Gandhi says the great powers did not search for a genuine basis of reconciliation for this crisis. The fact is that the United States, while it may have backed the wrong horse in General Yahya Khan of Pakistan, tried persistently for a peaceful solution. Mrs. Gandhi said as long ago as last July that the time for a peaceful solution had passed. The United States tried to get Yahya, who is a stubborn, truculent dictator, to stop his savage repression of the East Pakistanis, and he promised to establish civilian rule in both East and West Pakistan by the end of this month, but the Indians attacked on the 3rd of December. Mrs. Gandhi was told this when she visited the White House in November. She was also told that Yahya was willing to pull his forces back from the border area and willing to have his government negotiate with genuine East Pakistani political leaders. Mrs. Gandhi made no response to that, and the war started a few weeks later, which is why her letter makes such bitter reading in Washington today. As we said earlier, a new country was born today. What was East Pakistan is now Bangladesh, the Bengal nation. The new country is the 8th largest in the world in terms of population, 78 million people. It is also one of the poorest, with an income equal to $77 a year per person. All this poverty and all these people are crammed into an area only about the size of the state of Arkansas. The land does not yield enough food to feed the people, and crops are always subject to the calamity of monsoon floods. At the center of the flag of Bangladesh is a map of the new nation, colored in gold, because the people like to call their country Golden Bangladesh. There is pride, of course, in the flag, but the future of Bangladesh is not bright. Beyond its traditional problems, it must now face millions of returning refugees and must rebuild after the destruction of war. It could be difficult to set up a new government with the nation's most popular leader imprisoned in West Pakistan and with opposition from Maoist communists, possibly supported by Communist China. So Bangladesh will have to depend heavily on India if it is to survive, and India has problems of its own. Good night for NBC.